This is Mike Tatarski, host of the Vietnam Weekly podcast, coming to you from Ho Chi Minh City. A subject I rarely touch on in my work is the war. The American War as it's known here, or the Vietnam War to those of you listening overseas. This isn't out of disinterest. I majored in history in college, and the conflict is one of the defining events of the 20th century. It's more a reaction to the ongoing issue, or as I see it at least, of people abroad, and especially in the United States, viewing Vietnam exclusively through the lens of the war, even almost 50 years after its conclusion. Vietnam is a fascinating, complex place that doesn't deserve to be reduced to lazy comparisons and never-ending references to the latest contemporary quagmire being a given country's, quote, Vietnam, or, in the case of the U.S., another Vietnam. That being said, the war continues to have impacts here to this day. One of the most high-profile is the ongoing challenge presented by unexploded ordnance, or UXO. The U.S. military dropped over 5 million tons of bombs on Vietnam over roughly a decade, double the amount the Air Force dropped in all of World War II. While bombing raids took place across the country, they were heavily concentrated in the central provinces of Quang Binh and Quang Tri, the latter of which holds the dubious distinction of being the most bombed area in history. Countless amounts of those bombs didn't explode on impact, creating a long legacy of danger for Vietnamese people. UXO has killed over 40,000 people since 1975 and injured another 60,000. Just 2 weeks ago, a 200-pound bomb was discovered by construction crews in the center of Vinh, which is home to 500,000 people. International organizations such as the Mines Advisory Group and Project Renew, along with the Vietnamese government, are working to clear UXO, but the challenge is immense. Today's guest is Sarah.Goring, Country Director for the Mines Advisory Group, or MAG. The organization is marking 25 years of operations in Vietnam, entirely in Quang Binh and Quang Tri. They have disposed of over 390,000 explosive items since 1999, ranging from small cluster bomblets to huge 500-pound bombs, like one that was cleared in Đồng Hới in early April. We talked about the evolution of MAG's work in Vietnam over time, the importance of risk education, the cross-cutting impacts of UXO across agriculture, education, healthcare, and other sectors, how bombs are disposed of after being found, and ongoing efforts to survey and map UXO contamination. As always, if you have any comments, feedback, or guest suggestions, get in touch at matatarski@gmail.com. Let's get to my conversation with Sarah. Sarah, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
No problem. So we'll go ahead and jump right in. So you mentioned when I reached out to you that this is the 25th anniversary of Mines Advisory Group's, presence in Vietnam. So how has the organization's work evolved? I know that's a long period, but how has it evolved over that time?
Yeah, definitely. So, we started out with 31 people working for MAG back in 1999, although 16 of them still work for us, which I think shows the sort of commitment to the work, and hopefully the MAG is a good employer. But I think it's evolved massively in terms of staff. We're now nearly 750 people working in Vietnam. We're the biggest NGO in terms of people. Oh, wow. And the work is extensive. I think some of the big changes that I can see over the time, obviously I haven't been here personally for 25 years, but some of the changes that within the mine action sector, and then that's applied to Vietnam, we've seen changes in terms of now we have community liaison work. We've really recognized since that early days that it was always sort of known, but it was much more about clearing the items and actually realizing that, we need to be engaging with communities and authorities, and that's just grown and expanded over time. And then also on the authority side, they now have dedicated departments to support mine action. So in Quang Binh and Quang Tri, where we work, there are dedicated mine action centers that support and coordinate the work. And then at a national level, there's now the Vietnam National Mine Action Center. So that really helps to make sure that the work is coordinated, engaged. Database systems are so much better than they were. We have our data going back for 25 years, but it's now all mapped into an amazing system, so you can see exactly which land has been cleared, where the bombs were, what the bombs were, all of that, which is really important data to be able to plan, coordinate, prioritize land. So, and that community liaison part is also really important to work with communities to make sure that we're clearing land that they want to clear. And coordinating with other departments, because again, this is such a cross-cutting area that impacts, majority of what we do is agricultural land, but it's also really important in these communities. If you're going to build a school or any kind of construction, that the land is cleared first. And we still to this day are clearing land for new schools, kindergartens and such like, that we find items, unexploded bombs in that area. So, clearance is really crucial for all sectors to ensure development. And I think some of the other changes that I can see over 25 years, and again within the sector more generally, is probably our focus, and this is maybe a global thing, on gender diversity and inclusion. It is a very male-dominated sector, as you can imagine. I think there's been a lot more focus, certainly maybe the last 10 years, on ensuring that, we do have that diversity with the organisation. We started off with 5% women, and we had one woman who actually wasn't technical. She was on the administrative support side, and she still works for us. And now we're about 30% women. So we're still not there yet. And there's other diversity angles to that, not just women, but that's definitely changed as well. And I think more recently changes is a growing recognition of that we need to work responsibly in terms of the environment. So being aware of our impact on the environment, and also the work's impact, and how can we work best. There are always going to be limits with that, because the work inherently within the work, that it's not great for the environment in some vehicles and destroying bombs, and it's a balance between what do you want. But we increasingly try to make sure we focus on that, to make sure that we consider that in how we operate.
And we'll get a bit more granular on some of the work you do, but you mentioned, building schools or health clinics or hospitals, for example. So something you pointed out when we were emailing before this call is how this work cuts across sectors. And maybe that's not really something I thought about, to be honest. But how does, UXO clearance, or, for example, how does that kind of cut across health, agriculture, environmental?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's for us, it's that it's inherent in it. When we're looking at sort of the sustainable development goals, it cross-cuts across most of them. Agriculture and poverty, food, access to food and food security is crucial and massive part of it, because if you can't use your land properly or to its full extent, you're not going to have that productivity to generate food for people. And then same for building schools and construction, and just that availability and like additional cost essentially of doing that. So if you're going to, and then it comes down to that business investment as well. Like these areas, I understand it. If I was a business person and I'm like, well, I could invest in this area that needs clearance, which will cost me more money to build a factory or whatever, or I can invest in this area. Understandably, you understand the business decision. So these communities get further and further behind. So it's really important in the development sector that we coordinate to make sure that these areas have access to the clearance, so that then they don't fall behind in other areas and other sectors. But then for us, it's also about maximizing impact. We are a big organization now, and we can clear a lot, but there's so much to clear. So we need to make sure we're also partnering with organizations so that they can maximize the impact of the work. So after we've cleared the land, we want to then try as far as possible to partner with local authorities, other NGOs, other sectors, businesses as well, if we can, to sort of say, great, we'll clear the land for you, and then can you invest in it to support these communities to develop? So on the government side, that works well here, that they will, if they're going to build a school, they will get in touch with us and we can clear it for things like that. But it's important that we do that across sectors.
And when it comes to actually finding, UXO or determining where it is, you mentioned that there's, national organizations and provincial organizations on the government side now, but is MAG going out and looking for it? Or do people report it if they find it? Is some combination of that?
Yeah, combination. Basically, there are reporting hotlines in the two provinces we work in that are now, used to be operated by MAG, are now operated by the provincial authorities in Quang Tri and Quang Binh. So there's a hotline number which we advertise through our community liaison teams on our Facebook page and other means, so that if someone finds something, they report it into the hotline and don't try to deal with it themselves. And again, actually coming back to your first question, that's a big thing that's changed over time, because 25 years ago, there was no one to report to, there was no one operating, communities were just having to deal with it themselves because the contamination is so extensive. And we now see a real change in that people are reporting items. And we have a dedicated team in both provinces that respond to these calls every day. So every day, these two teams are going out just solely to deal with community reports of items. And they will go assess the situation and either destroy that bomb in situ or move it if it's safe to do so, they can defuse it. So that's a really key part. And then in terms of the clearance, we do some development tasks like a school building or things that we coordinate with the authorities, but the majority of it is evidence-based. So the main contamination profile that we're aiming to clear here in Vietnam is cluster munitions. So those are bombs that there's a cluster bomb unit, which is a big casing, and within that casing there was hundreds of submunitions, and it opens in midair, and those submunitions disperse over an area of about 3 football fields, and there was an extensive amount of cluster munitions dropped on Vietnam. And so with that kind of contamination, where you find one item, you will find more. So that's where we work. We work with communities. We find evidence points, whether it's from historical data, accident data, all of that, to find one evidence point, which is a cluster bomb. And then we can survey out from there to try and find the boundary of that contaminated area, and then we will clear that. So that's how we work.
Yeah, so I mean, cluster munitions, I know that was in the news, I guess, last year at some point, because there was debate about the U.S. providing that to Ukraine for their defense against Russia. So I suppose that's kind of like, the size of a tennis ball or something along those lines.
Yeah, there are different types and different shapes and also different colors, which actually some of them are bright yellow, some of them, look like balls and things. Actually, that makes them risky for children that find them. So yeah, but they're about the size of a tennis ball. Okay.
So yeah, that's particularly dangerous. And so you mentioned kind of community, improved community awareness over the last couple of decades. MAG's website talks about risk education sessions. I was wondering if you could kind of describe what those are and their importance.
Yeah, absolutely. So our community liaison teams do a number of things, as well as sort of supporting with the hotline calls and reports out from the community, and doing that survey work in the communities to try and find that evidence, talking to people. One of the crucial parts that we've introduced is explosive ordnance risk education. So we call it EORE for short. So this is our teams going into communities, into schools. We target 3 main groups, which is primary school children, just because they're most at risk and need that information because they're brand new. Teenagers, which again, it's a slightly different risk category because teenagers tend to, obviously not exclusively, but that more sort of bravado, right? To, oh, look at me, I'm so big, I can touch a bomb, that kind of risk profile. And then farmers, people working out in communities. So those are the 3 groups that we are most at risk and that we target. And so we adapt the approach depending on the group, because of course what we will say to adults versus primary school children is a bit different, but the messaging is the same. And it's about how to be safe behaviors. What are the most at risk behaviors, which is again like lighting fires, striking things when people are working in fields, and how to try. And for children, it's anything, touching, don't play with it, don't throw it. And again, that key messaging of don't touch it, report it. So with adults and teenagers, a bit more about the hotline number, and then with primary school children, it'd be report to an adult, report to a teacher, your parents, that kind of thing. So it's just that messaging of what to do if they find it, because that's been the biggest challenge. Is before people didn't know what to do, they didn't know how to report, and they dealt with it themselves.
And this is largely concentrated in Quang Tri and Quang Binh?
Yeah, that's where we operate at the moment for MAG, yeah.
Okay. I mean, those were, I suppose, around the old DMZ, so presumably the most heavily bombed provinces.
Yep, Quang Tri was the most heavily bombed, but that doesn't necessarily actually equate to most heavily contaminated, because it's around a square meterage, right? So actually Quang Tri is a smaller province. So we actually predict that Quang Binh might end up being more contaminated in terms of square meters, just because it's a larger province.
I see.
But both are very heavily contaminated.
Okay. Yeah, and then so kind of on the data side, I mean, you said there's now this like strong map of areas that have been cleared and everything like that. Is less UXO being found every year as we move away from the war? I mean, it was 50, 60 years ago, or what kind of are the trends of this?
I mean, unfortunately for MAG, no. Over the last sort of 5 years, we've found just under 20,000 items on average per year, and they're clearing about 34 square kilometers. So we find it, even to be honest, over the last 10 years, we've found quite a consistent rate of items. And it's mainly down to amount of resources and capacity within the sector, as opposed to, unfortunately, any decrease in the amount of items being found, just because we're moving in new areas, right? So the extent of contamination is wide. There's a more comprehensive survey done in Quang Tri now, which has established that there's about 620 square kilometers of land that's confirmed as contaminated, and about a third of that has been cleared so far, and we're working on the rest. And then in terms of nationally, it's harder to know. We don't have super reliable data in terms of there hasn't been a physical survey done, but the government did do more of a desktop survey from bombing data that we have from the US and such like. And that showed that there was, across the country, just over 61,000 square kilometers of land, which is just under 19% of the area of the country. We know that's not necessarily 100% accurate, but it gives an indication of how much of Vietnam is contaminated, and it's very extensive. Again, that will be to a differing degree in terms of the amount of contamination within an area, so the number of bombs per square meter kind of thing you find, but the actual area is extensive.
Yeah, and I suppose as new areas are opened up for urban development, that would presumably be areas that hadn't been surveyed before as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what often sort of maybe surprises people is that, we're not working in the middle of nowhere. We're not working in remote areas. We found a 500-pound bomb in Đồng Hới city centre last week that was reported through the military, and we responded to. And I don't know if you have notes for the podcast, I can share the link to the news stories to show
absolutely.
that. So this is not remote stuff. We're working right by houses in used land right within the centre of communities. So as things expand, there'll probably be more contamination found for sure.
And then, in terms of like personal livelihoods and personal risk, besides the quite obvious risk of something potentially exploding, what are kind of the risks posed by this UXO?
Yeah, death and injury obviously is a massive risk that's one of our core objectives of why we work and why we operate to remove that risk for people living in these communities. But the biggest thing we notice, and particularly in Vietnam, is around the impact it has on socioeconomic development for people. We see this especially in agriculture in Vietnam, where it's the contamination is so extensive that people can't not use this land, right? This is people's livelihoods. This is how they survive. But as a result, people use it as minimally as possible. So it continues that sort of subsistence agriculture concept, or just lower economic gains for people. And we really find that post clearance, and again, because we've got that 25-year history, we can go back to communities 5 or 10 years after we've done the clearance to really see that change. And of course, there's other factors to this as Vietnam develops. There's broader factors to this beyond mine action, but we really see that people are confident to be able to use their land, and they change land use. So before clearance, they would use it, but they would grow what required the least amount of digging or maintenance because of the risk. And after clearance, they're able to produce crops that have a higher economic benefit, but that they couldn't do before because it was just too dangerous. So what do you do? Do you take that risk to earn more money? That is the ultimate risk, right? And so most people don't, understandably. So we really see that they change crops to peanuts, chives, that kind of thing that has a higher yield and higher income. And actually, what communities here report to us is better for the soil. So the crops are better, the soil's improving because they can grow better crops. And that's another reason why it's really important for us to partner with governments and with other organizations that can do that sort of sustainable farming, sustainable agriculture to help these communities environmentally as well. Quang Tri, Quang Binh, and the central provinces, are massively affected by climate change and the flooding that happens. Horrendous flooding back in 2020, and each year it floods. So we're also trying to work with communities to sort of support them in that side and have that follow-on impact from mine action that other organizations can support with.
And I was wondering if you could kind of walk us through how you actually clear something, whether it's a cluster bomb or maybe a 500-pound bomb. What are the steps or the options? I've seen videos of things being detonated, but I'm sure that's not the only method. But how does that work?
Yeah, sure. So cluster bombs, the fuse is inside the bomb, so they are not safe to move. So they are all destroyed in situ. So how our teams work, we have 41 clearance teams in Vietnam at the moment with BAG, and they're 13 person per team. So each team has a team leader, a deputy, a medic, and then 10 deminers. And they use metal detectors. They cover the land, so they lay out ropes to make sure every single inch is covered, and it's all done very systematically within very strict safety protocols, as you can imagine, and standard operation procedures. And so they'll take the detector over to get the signal, and then someone will use a handheld detector to sort of pinpoint that signal more accurately. And the national standards here is aiming to detect the amount of metal in a particular type of cluster bomb called a BLU-26, again, just slightly smaller than toad ball, that amount of metal down to 30 centimeters. And that is determined by the national authorities because it's what the risk profile is. And Laos, for instance, is 20 centimeters. I think Cambodia is 25. because that's just based on what's the most likely use. If we're doing a development task like a school building, we would do to a greater depth on request. So, but the standard depth is 30 centimeters. So then they dig. They use a shovel to slowly excavate the land to find it. If we have to excavate every signal, because you don't know until you dig down whether it's a bomb or just other scrap. So we find construction scrap and stuff, but majority of the scrap we find is fragments from the bombs that did explode. So we're finding a lot of scrap metal as well in that process, and we have to investigate every signal. So they will dig down. If it is a bomb, they would retreat, call in the team leader, who's more higher qualifications in terms of to demolish the items, and then essentially we ultimately, most teams find often more than one item on one day. So we actually don't destroy it straight away. We will mark it safely, and then they're all destroyed at the end of the working day by each team. And so they destroy them by adding explosives to it. So they will put on a small amount of explosives. Again, they calculate the amount, depends on the item and what have you, and then run cables and detonate it. For the bigger items, where possible, so some of them are safe to move. Some projectiles and stuff, they haven't been fired. They or have been fired. They might, depending. And again, our technical teams are able to determine if they're safe to move or not. A qualified technical staff. And so some of the bigger 500-pound or 750-pound bombs that we find, our senior technical staff can go in and they can determine either whether it's safe to move or whether they can defuse it and then move it, because the blast radius for these things is quite extensive. It can be, 500-pound would be over a kilometre blast radius that we'd need to evacuate, and it's quite a big process to destroy it where we find it, as you can imagine. So where possible, we will move it then to a designated demolition site, which is designated by the military, that's safe. There's no buildings and what have you around it, and we'll move that and destroy that there where possible.
Okay, yeah, that's all super interesting. And I mean, are your teams finding, is this every day they're working on UXO, or is it what's the frequency of either reports or finding material?
Yep. Every day we're destroying bombs. So with 41 clearance teams and 2 roving teams that go out to respond to the community, we're destroying bombs every single day. And we work Monday to Friday, all year round. There are seasonal challenges, like if it's pouring down with rain, we can't operate. And you can imagine in the heat that is this week, it becomes, there's lots of difficult challenges. If an area is flooded, we can't clear underwater, so we'd have to go back to that area. So there's some seasonal challenges that we have. But no, we operate all year round, take breaks obviously for tent and such like, but we're operating 12 months of the year.
Okay. And I know there's other organizations working on UXO as well. You said, your presence is in Quang Binh, Quang Tri. If somebody finds something in a different province and calls MAG, do you guys go work on that, or what happens there?
And no, unfortunately, we can't make, partly because of logistics more than anything, just for travel time and what have you, and also because of permissions. But so the military, so there are some other humanitarian operators in the country that there's some that work in Hue and such like, but otherwise it would go down to the provincial military to respond to that. And there are government teams that are working. Again, it's all governed under the Ministry of National Defence here. So there are military teams that are doing clearance as well, but any calls outside of Quang Binh and Quang Tri, unfortunately, MAG wouldn't be able to respond to.
Okay. And then, looking at the future, unfortunately, it's kind of clear that I suppose this war could almost go on forever, just given the magnitude of bombing that took place during the war. Is that kind of down to funding, or what is MAG's kind of long-term vision for Vietnam?
Yeah, there's a bit of combination of both. It is down to funding. Unfortunately, there is a lot of work to be done, and we're very fortunate to have extensive funding from the US government that actually continues to increase, and we'll be expanding our operations this year and next year because there's additional money coming from the US, and we have funding from the Japanese government as well. And we're always seeking to get new donors to the sector because, hopefully, again, we can see the impacts of this work and the positive impacts on community that this work has. But I think the government is also discussing around, and MAG is supporting the residual contamination management. So that is longer term, looking at, what happens when it's at a point where, look, we can't be doing active clearance and it's a responsive thing. So a lot of countries in Europe, for instance, the UK being one of them, is in that phase. The UK finds bombs every day and has military teams going out to respond to them. So Vietnam will get to that stage and is having those conversations. Actually, in fact, Quang Tri is probably closest to that, just because that's where we've worked for a long time. It's got a very high capacity. Out of our 750 staff, more than 500 are in Quang Tri. We're bigger there, and so are the other operators. So Quang Tri is okay, still a long way, probably 10 years maybe, but it's looking to a point of having impact-free status. And there's lots of conversations going on that we're supporting the authorities there to plan for that. So to plan for this impact-free status, what does that mean? What are the criteria that the government set? There's no hard and fast rules actually on that. There's guidance in international mine action standards. But again, it's down to what they deem impact-free. But there will always be residual contamination. So it's planning for that, resourcing that, and defining that criteria. So that's something that's being worked on at the moment to plan for that sort of next phase. And it's a long way in advance, but the earlier you plan for these things, the better.
And then really to kind of, I guess, drive home the human impact, do you have some sense of how frequently, I suppose within these provinces where MAG operates, like how frequently does something blow up, or does somebody get injured? Does that happen frequently?
It does happen. It's dramatically reduced in the country, thankfully, and I think there's a combination of reasons for that. I think within Quang Tri and Quang Binh, certainly the extensive mine action work and the risk education work has been critical to that. Also, government regulations and rules on scrap metal collecting, and there's been more enforcement on that in terms of that it's illegal, and also the price of scrap metal reduced. So there's much less of that. I mean, people I go out to and meet in the community, I've been out on lots of sort of calls from the community with our roving team, and I'll chat to the person, and quite a lot have always said, especially older people in the province, have said, "Oh yeah, I used to scrap. That was my job." Even some of our staff before they joined MAG, they were hunting scrap metal because, again, it was an income, and it's hard to blame people, right? Like, it's an education thing and it's a risk. And what do you do? Do you feed your family, or do you? So that has made a big change in accident rates. But accidents do happen. Unfortunately, we don't have comprehensive data on the national picture. It's something we're trying to work with the authorities to capture, because, again, that's a question we always get, but it's really important in terms of the impact and allocation of funding and stuff for that. But within Quang Binh, I mean, there was an accident last year in which someone died, and there was 3 accidents in Quang Tri the year before. So the rates have definitely reduced, but they are still happening.
And I mean, I guess I know you don't operate beyond those provinces, but is your sense that kind of similar progress is being made in other provinces?
No, unfortunately, I don't think it is. Again, just because of resources, the government does have teams and it does put resources into this, but it's hard because the contamination is so extensive. And it's hard to get a sense of how much, again, there's this impact survey, but on a provincial level and the actual on the ground, until you're there, it's really hard for us to be able to know that. You do see reports we try to monitor these things in terms of news reports, and you do see reports, particularly the bigger bombs from other provinces every so often, and you do see reports of accidents. There's an awful one in Kon Tum. Can't remember now, sorry if it's last year, the year before at this point, but where I think 5 people were killed and injured. So it does still happen, and we try to monitor those accident rates across provinces, and we are seeing them. So the contamination is definitely there.
Okay.
But the progress of work, I was going to say, the progress of work will always be slower, just because, MAG has 750 staff and the other operators have, the amount of funding and humanitarian support from international operators here in Quang Tri and Quang Binh, and to a smaller extent way, it is significant. And so the work in other provinces is just always going to be the 63 provinces, and all of them are contaminated according to the government survey. And so they just don't have the resources to be able to support that.
And I know, there's also big issues with chemical contamination from the war as well. Is that separate from MAG's work?
It is, yeah. It's not something that we deal with. Again, it's just a very different skill set and technical set. So it's not something we're involved with. But yeah, there is work to support that in different areas.
Okay.
And the other part that, again, we don't do as MAG, although we support it more generally within the sector, because a big part of the mine action sector is victim assistance. So other operators and the government are supporting victims So whether that is supporting families who've lost someone from a non-exploded ordnance accident, or someone who's been injured with long-term life injuries, prosthetics and orthotic support and that kind of thing. So that's a really important part of the sector as well. And we don't directly work in that, but again, within the sector, we coordinate. We're part of the victim assistance task force under the Mine Action Working Group and things like that. To be able to support that sector is really key as well.
Okay, maybe final question is there any other aspect of MAG's work here that maybe you think people might not be aware of, or some other angle that isn't as discussed as much?
I suppose really just what I mentioned before around sort of actually Mine Action and MAG's work in Vietnam has evolved over the last 25 years, that realizing sort of the broader areas of collaboration that we need to support, that be that the victim assistance I just mentioned, supporting people with disabilities, and that diversity and inclusion and environmental impact that I think is really key. And we're always keen as well to learn more on that and to do more work with other sectors on that. I think one of the big things that's great actually for Vietnam, I don't know if you're aware of, is that January this year, the Prime Minister signed a National Action Plan for Women, Peace and Security, which has a big part of Mine Action in it. So we're trying to sort of work with the authorities on how we can support that, to really, again, embed that sort of gender diversity and inclusion within Mine Action work and the importance of it. And that's not just within employment, so employing women, which we do, and having women leaders and such like, but also on the community side. It's really important that we evaluate the contamination impacts on different people. And again, that comes with the cross-cutting, because you can look at, agricultural initiatives. Women are affected differently in agriculture than men. And so therefore, if we're working in Mine Action, we need to consider the views of women and men and other different groups, people with disabilities, ethnic minorities, all of that, to make sure that we're being inclusive in how we operate internally and within the implementation of our work. So that's something we're always trying to do better, and to partner with other organizations as well to support those kind of areas.
Okay, that's great. Well, Sarah, thanks so much for taking some time to talk to me. I appreciate it. I'll include links to some of the stories and issues you mentioned in the show notes, along with a link to MAG's website and all that. So yeah, thanks again.
No, amazing. It's been really great to talk to you, Mike. And yeah, thanks so much for doing it. And please do reach out if there's ever anything we can get in touch with. And anyone who listens to this, please do get in touch with me. I'm happy for you to share my contact details in the show notes as well, because we're always really interested to collaborate and partner with people as well. So thanks.
Yeah, will do. Thank you.
That's it for this week's episode of the Vietnam Weekly podcast. Connect with the Vietnam Weekly on Threads, LinkedIn, or Instagram. Thank you so much for listening, and please rate or review the show on your preferred podcast platform. See you next week.